This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 30 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Engaging Experts. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today I'm excited to welcome Christopher Larson to the show. Now, Mr. Larson is the president of Larson Elite, a consulting firm for the electrical utility industry. He's a certified fire and explosion investigator and an expert in the technical standards, operational protocols, and best practices for the electrical utility industry. Mr. Larson, thank you so much for joining me here today on Engaging Experts.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Of course. Let's jump into it. So you've spent over 35 years in the electric utility construction industry. How did you first become involved in expert witnessing?
Interestingly enough, this was back in probably the late 80s to early 90s. I was working, we were working down in the LA area, Bellflower area. And the foreman that I was working for, he had worked when I was still an apprentice at the time. He had worked for another contractor, another company, and he was telling me about that company. He said, and the guy was an electrical engineer, and he says, but he makes more money doing expert witness work than he does actually running his business. And I said, what? What do you mean? He said, well, I don't really know that much about it, but they just, every so often they bring these boxes full of paperwork, and then, he studies all that stuff. And so it's been plaguing me ever since then. And then, really, so it's been however long that is, 30 plus years, I've been thinking about this. And then in December 15th of 2023, I'd been with a company, I've been so fortunate in my career. I've worked for the nation's largest companies, and which just the last 13 years was a director of safety and training for one of the largest electrical contractors in the country. And a lot of corporate changes took place, and we split up the company. And so I wound up, I was a director of safety and training, and I wound up getting laid off. And I'd already hired my replacements before that. So, which was, timing was good for me. It was perfect for me. And so I started thinking, well, geez, I realized, I sat back and realized when's the last time I actually took any vacation. And it turns out it was like 25 years ago when I got married, our honeymoon, we took a week off. I've always been in positions where it was hard to leave. So I thought, man, I'm not sure. Am I going to retire? Do I want to, start a consulting business? What do I want to do? And so I kind of went down that road. I eventually decided, well, I'm going to start my own business, rather than go back to work for someone. And it's just been fantastic. I truly love, I dug into it. I learned all I could about expert witness. And for me and my background, it's exciting work because the forensic part of it, right? So I'm dealing with my first case is actually 10 years old, like 2 months ago. So it's been going on for a long time. And, so they'd never found an expert witness with my background. So they were all excited to get me. And it's been phenomenal because I'm digging through these old accident reports and incidents and what happened and, all, the rules that were in play back then. And it's just been, I'm loving it.
So you were actively seeking engagements. It didn't just fall out of your lap, out of nowhere, like happens a lot of the time. Well, let me ask you this. How did you go about finding and establishing yourself as an expert witness? As somebody with obviously the background and the expertise, how did you make that transition into expert witnessing?
Well, the first thing I had to do is really research just what the heck does an expert witness do, right? So that's where I started. And there's one of the things that, and I hope people are taking advantage of this, but there's so much great information out there that's free. Roundtable has a ton of it. There's so much free information out there, and it's so exciting. And I even watched my cousin Vinny a few times, because of that. If you're familiar with the movie, I'm sure you are, but I learned a lot about the industry, and I was reading everything that I could get, and I was just so enthralled with it or excited about it. And so I started looking for more, and I actually took a course on, how to be successful as an expert witness. And so I went through the course, and I've constantly picking every single day. I'm looking for something new, reading something new. There's just so much. There's great books out there. There's a ton out there. And I think I will tell you one of the most interesting things I think about this has been a surprise, because my dealings with attorneys have always been, I got involved with a lot of legal things when I was a director of safety and training and stuff like that. So my dealings with attorneys have always been a different, even worse, I guess, if you had to hire one for some reason. So my dealings with attorneys were always a little bit different. But what I've found out here is just there is, at least for what I do, there's such a need out there and it's so, I mean, the average layperson doesn't have any idea what a power lineman does, or, how does a power get from wherever they make it to your light switch to your bedroom. And what I've really loved about this is they treat me with it's an amazing amount of respect. And I've found that to be just really refreshing. And man, I've met some really great attorneys over the course of time, but it's different when, they're not out to get you, right? And they need you. So, that's been real refreshing.
Let's talk about those initial phone calls. So an attorney reaches out, says, we've got a case with this general fact pattern. We think that you might be able to help us. What are the sorts of questions that they ask you? And what are the sorts of questions that you ask them to make sure that it's a good fit? Because it is a two-way vetting process. Both sides are feeling out each other at the start of a new engagement.
Absolutely. And I remember the first, few calls I got, I was so excited. I think one of the most important things you have to ask is, how did you find out about me? Right? Because marketing is a huge part of what we do. There's a lot to that. And I'm forever, every day learning more and more about that. Anyway, so, there's a lot of questions that you really have to ask. And I've compiled now a list of the questions that I need to know, like, plaintiff or defense, that was a big one right off the get go. My first ones, I wasn't really sure what side was I on. And really for me, and for anybody out there that's doing this sort of business, it really doesn't matter to, plaintiff or defense. So you're not out there, this isn't your case to try. You were just out there for your expertise and to share your expertise and to educate the trier of facts and jury and the attorneys on what should or shouldn't have been done, so that's kind of always been interesting. And it's been, consciously step aside from that and realize, look, it's not my case. I'm not trying it. I'm just there to just the facts, ma'am. And so I've come up with a lot, quite a bit of, quite a sizable list of questions that I like to ask. One, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, plaintiff or defense, where are we in the case? One thing that I get in my line of work, personal injury is a major part of it. So, I make sure that I find out, I want to find out, okay, what kind of shape is the person in? I mean, could it be a fatality? And I've dealt with those as well. But, I want to find out, what's the status of the victim, or the person, how, what happened there? And I think a big part of the feel out is making in most of the attorneys, all except for a couple, most of the attorneys that I've spoken with, they're genuine. They're not, they don't they've never tried to lead me down, here's what we're looking for. We're basically saying, well, we're looking for somebody to say X, Y, and Z. I've not had that happen. In fact, for the most part, they'll tell me, look, I'm just looking for your opinion. I'm not trying to, sway you one way or another. And I really appreciate that, because that's just, that's what we're here to do, is be honest and put our opinion out there, whether it fits their narrative or not. You have a responsibility to put out the truth. So, yeah, so that, that's one of the things I like to kind of find out where they're going with that. And actually had a case, they were just looking for my opinion, and it kind of surprised me, but it was a personal injury. And the company that contacted me was actually, they were trying to find out, it was a contractor and one of their employees got hurt real bad. And they were trying to find out, well, what they wanted to know is, did their employees do the right thing? And after, going through a bunch of research, my response was no, they did not do the right thing. As a matter of fact, they were contributors to the incident taking place. Right. So I explained everything and, brought up here's my reasonings why, here's my opinion on this, and they even had an expert that was there to talk about. It was a decayed pole that fell over, right? It was, and the bottom was just absolute mush. And they even had a wood expert that was there to testify that, oh yeah, that was, the wood was just fine. Well, you could see it laying on the ground. The inside's completely mush. You can see 2 or 3 feet up into the hollow pole. And one thing that we do as a lineman before we climb a pole is it's called a hammer test. So you take your hammer out and you pound the bottom of the pole all the way up to really as far as you could reach. It's like hitting a drum, right? You know whether something's hollow or mushy or whatever. It's just that's the first test. And then if it's questionable, then the test proceeds from there. And so this wood expert testified, oh yeah, that wood just fine. They would have never known that's hollow. But and again, you could clearly see the top of the pole was hollow, the bottom of the pole was hollow where it fell. And the attorney, the actually was an insurance company I was talking to. They said, well, the expert said it sounds good. I said, well, you look back at your expert's background. Said in 1976, when he was in college, he spent 2 weeks in Minnesota testing poles. Right. So, I've tested thousands of them and had to trust my life to him. So, there's no way he would, really know that. Anyways, make a long story short, what I wound up telling him not what they wanted to hear. And the response I got was, well, okay, thank you. We'll keep looking. And, and that part is, and I understand they have they're trying to get something accomplished as well. But I was worried about, oh man, am I ever going to get paid? But actually, they were one of the best payers I've had. They paid right on time and quickly. So, but that was interesting. And I'll tell you another little story with that. So I dealt with in my last role as a director of safety and training for major, well, it's the largest utility contractor in the country. And I dealt a lot over the years with corporate attorneys, right? Corporate counsel. And when I decided to do this, I gave him a call, just let him know, what I'm doing. And he first question he asked me was, he's corporate counsel, right? He goes, well, what side are you on, defense or plaintiff? I said, well, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I'll go on either. He goes, got real quiet. I go, what's the matter? He goes, well, I can hire somebody to tell me that you have, red curly hair, which I know the listeners won't see this, but I basically have no hair. So, and I asked him, I said, hey, Mr. Counsel, I said, how long have you known me? And he said, well, he said, have you ever known me to not be anything but truthful? And he goes, well, no. I said, well, then my answer is it doesn't matter to me. So I thought that was interesting. And there's, and I haven't really run out to those type. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have had a couple of cases that I turned down because, there was no merit to the case, and you can tell they were, trying to go for something that didn't have merit, and I wasn't going to take, or I've had cases that I've turned down where they're asking me to do something that was not in my wheelhouse. One of them, I'll share this story. I was contacted by the plaintiff himself saying that, he was trying to sue somebody, but he said his attorney asked him to, seek out, expert witnesses to support his case. And, asked me if I'd sign a non-disclosure and all that sort of stuff. But the case had nothing, it wasn't in my wheelhouse, right? It had to do with electricity. And I absolutely could have taken that case and explained everything away, but wasn't quite in my wheelhouse. And so I turned that one down because it seemed like, for one, why would the attorney have their client calling around looking for people, and they're just trying to fish to get, to find somebody that would say what they wanted to say. So and the thing is, I think that we all have to, I'm still doing this business, and, there are a few things out there that you could do that would be a career. It would just completely destroy your career. And, man, it's just not worth it for, you miss out on many, many future paydays for one payday that, that could end it all. So integrity is extremely important in this industry.
Absolutely. You talked a little bit about getting paid and how the one of the engagements that you declined or that you ended up not going forward with was a very quick payer. Do you have any particular items that you like to put into contracts in your engagements? Do you like to, for instance, take a non-refundable retainer? Do you do project rates? Do you have different rates depending on what you're doing? Tell me a little bit about your billing structure.
Sure. Well, I do have a retention agreement, and I have, and it's a non-refundable retention agreement, which I bill against, obviously, so they're not paying money for nothing. And I have started and sweated it out. I have started a couple of cases early on without having that retainer agreement in hand. And so it's kind of interesting if you do that, and then it gets down to where the attorney's needing something, and you just say, well, I can't move forward until I get this squared away. It's amazing how, went from never happening to all of a sudden you get a special courier standing outside your door handing you a check. So I do have a retainer agreement, non-refundable retainer, and I highly recommend that people do not start work. It's one thing to have the initial discussion to make sure that you're a good fit for the case, and the attorney,
Sure.
that counsel thinks you're a fit, and you're a fit for it. That's obviously going to start. But before you present anything or do any work, I believe in having a retainer agreement and not starting until you get that. As far as different rates for everything, I look at it as, and I also do, there's two things I do. I do accident investigation, incident or accident investigation, and I do expert witness services. When I first started, I was doing other things, actually, like you mentioned, being consulting and stuff. So I first initially was doing expert witness training. And then what I learned from expert witness training is sometimes the attorneys don't like that that's all you do. They like you still be engaged in, other activities within your realm, your industry. So it doesn't look like you're just some hired gun out there. Right. So, and all I wanted to do was expert witness. So I started bringing in safety consulting and training consulting. And then through a long series of events, the crane trainer that I used to have that worked for me, best crane trainer in the entire country, actually, he wound up, he wound up getting laid off as well. Like as I mentioned, the companies I was working for, they made a bunch of changes. So he called me up, and I thought, man, it's because I had planned on doing crane training certification in my business. So I found out he was laid off. He lives in Vegas. So I jumped on the motorcycle and rode up there the next day, and we sat down and hashed everything out. We were going to completely corner the market on crane training. And then what dawned on me at that point in time is, let's say, I live in Southern California. So, the biggest utility in Southern California is Southern California Edison. So for an example, let's say I'm providing crane training for Southern California Edison, and now an expert witness opportunity comes up. There's going to be a conflict of interest there. The opposing attorney is going to go, oh, Mr. Larson, you're here as a, witness, for the SCE or against them either way. But do you not also have business with them, right? So is that, so I realized, man, everything else I do is going to be a conflict of interest. So I stopped all that stuff, actually rebranded myself, started my business over. And now all I do is an accident investigation and expert witness services. And those two really go hand in hand because, for example, I was involved with a real recent major utility fire in a mall. And, so I was brought in to investigate that. Well, eventually there's going to be lawsuits that come out of that as well, right? Because it was a major mall and they were shut down and, huge cost incurred. Well, where are they going to turn to when they need an expert witness? But you'd go to the person that did the investigation for you. So those two went hand in hand. And one of the things that I was getting at to answer your question as far as different rates towards things is I look at it, my time is my time. And
Sure.
so I charge the same for whatever I do. It doesn't matter if it's in court, if I'm looking through paperwork, I just have a flat rate and I stick with that flat rate. I do have an overnight rate if I have to, fly somewhere and travel. And one of the things that, I'm not sure what everybody else does is, but as far as like flights and stuff, so, you're supposed to be there 2 hours early and, you might have layovers and all this sort of stuff. And what I do as far as air travel is concerned, I charge a half hour to get to the airport and not the 2 hours ahead of time. So I'll charge a half hour just to get to the airport. And then I bill for the exact, the stipulated flight time, right? So I'm not charging for the 2 hours I have to go there early. If there's a layover or something like that, I don't charge for that. I just charge a half hour plus the stipulated flight time, the half hour to get to the airport and a half hour to get from the airport to the hotel. Whether that's even if it's a 2 hour drive, I just charge a half hour. So it's flat. It's not, you don't want to nickel and dime your clients to death with all that sort of stuff. And I get it. It's your time and, layovers happen, that stuff, but that's not the client's fault. So I try to keep things very fair with that.
Sure, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about a couple general topics. How do you get off on the right foot? So you decided to accept an engagement. You had mentioned earlier that one of the nice things about working with attorneys so far as an expert witness is that they've conferred a lot of respect to you and your career. What are the other aspects of a good initial engagement?
Well, one thing that, I used to teach a lot of leadership classes across the country. And one of the analogies that I've always used is what happens a lot with leadership is they assume their people know what they want, right? They never sit you down. It's rare. In my entire career, I've had one foreman sit me down and tell me exactly what he expected, right? And I remember that today. When I was a foreman out in the field, a leader, I did that. I'd sit him down and tell him exactly what I expected. So there's no, and the analogy that I use is your people can't hit a bullseye if you don't show them where the target is. So I explained that little tidbit to the people and said, I want to know, what do you expect from me? What's a bullseye for me to be, a successful expert witness for you? What do you expect from me? And that opens up the door, and it lets them clearly tell you, and there's some responsibility on their part that goes along with that, because if they tell me, well, yeah, I don't want emails, I want you to call me, or if they don't tell me that stuff and they're getting emails, well, I didn't know. So I think and it really does. I think it shows, you can just feel it actually, it shows your client that, look, I'm here, we're working, this is, do together. I'm going to do the best I can, but I want to know what you think is the best. What do you expect from me? And and it's not happened yet, but I suppose that could open up the door to someone say, well, actually, I expect you to say this, and to me, well, that was a great question, because it just opened up shown a huge red flag there. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So I think that's what's important. And I think people need I'm saying this, what I think. I handle this business at the high level business that it is. I see it's kind of, what I love is when I show up on these Zoom meetings and stuff. First meeting on any of them, I'm in a sport coat, sport jacket. I'm in I've got a nice shirt on. I don't wear a tie, but most of the time the attorneys are, they're not, they're in their t-shirts and stuff, which is fine. But I look at it, we get paid well for what we do, right? And it's high level stuff that could, some of these cases, I've been on cases worked in multi-millions of dollars. And, so I think we all need to act accordingly there. I've seen people even attorneys get on these Zoom calls, and they're driving down the road for one, and they've got their cell phones, and you get a shot straight up their nose, while they're trying to, and it's just like, man, that's just so, I think to do this business, at least in my view, right, learn everything you can about it and be a professional and treat it as the high level business that it is, because it is. And it's important that we carry ourselves that way. And including, beginning, as I mentioned earlier, starting with integrity.
You bring up Zoom, and it's true. A lot of actions are happening, even depositions, even for full trials in some cases, are happening on Zoom. Do you find it better, worse, or neutral when you are appearing on camera versus showing up to a court or to a deposition?
I actually really don't find it really any different, really, because I think, usually the dealings that I've had with the court side of things, they've been, well, I shouldn't say that. I was dealing with the LA court the other day, and it was kind of a little bit hokey setup, but I don't know. I think it's hugely helpful, obviously, to see each other. That's important. And I think it's important that they're able to hear you. So, even if you're using your laptop or something as your camera, but they make small little cameras that you could add to make it better visually, and they make microphones, and I set up my office with a professional studio, and I hear about that, right, and it makes you stand out when you're the only one that, like your setup, and I'm looking at what you have behind you, and everything. You just ooze professionalism there, like, and what you're doing. And I think that's something that we should be doing as well. Again, I just feel that we need to handle this business at the high level that it truly is.
Absolutely. Earlier, you had mentioned that you avoid conflicts of interest by not working as much in the fields that you're consulting on, or that you might be an expert witness in. How do you stay current? Are there particular certifications, or do you give talks? Do you watch videos? How do you stay current in your field without being involved in necessarily in areas where you used to be?
Yeah, great question. So I still on occasion teach. I attend that we have, I'm a member of the IBW, the union. So that's where the linemen are. So I stay very much engaged with that. I go to the union meetings, and I have a lot of friends that are in this industry. And not to mention, there's a lot of stuff online, that you can keep. I mean, it's not hard to find something, that some linemen were injured, or, helicopter crash, or, burn. That information's out there, and you just have to, you need to stay on top of your business. It's changed a lot since, when I first started. We had today, when I first started, we had a crew consisted of 4 people. We had a digger derrick truck, which is like, a little crane truck, that dug holes and set poles. And we had a flatbed, a crummy, we would call it. And that's all we had for equipment. Today, I mean, we had for 10 crews working in the yard, we had 1 bucket truck that we would have to share. And today's business is it's totally different. They all have, everybody's in a bucket truck. Sometimes there's 2 on the same crew. Think about the tools, and I use this analogy a lot. So in my, today, I use this when I'm having conversations, like teaching a class, and I'll bring apprentices and I'll say, the younger generation, you guys don't work near as hard as my generation did. And they get mad, you can see that. And I do it intentionally, they get all kind of twisted up a little bit, and panties getting a wad, and they look at you like, what? And I said, well, let's think about it. If you want to drill a hole in a pole, so, you're 50 feet up in the air, say whatever, right? And you need to put a hole in the pole. You guys just grab one of these new battery powered things, slam that battery in, and, you put a hole in there. And I said, but in my day, we'd bring out a big heavy generator, right, and run a cord up the pole between the energized conductors, which is, that's scary enough as it is right there. And, we'd have to do it. And I go, but think about that. That's how we did it. So what you do now is so much easier. Or if you want to cut the pole, you've got a battery operated thing to cut a pole, right? Well, we'd have to get the chains up and so on and so forth. And I go, but think about that. Think about the generation before me. The generation before me, they had to use what's called a brace and bit. So they had to drill each hole by cranking like a big egg beater to drill that hole through the pole, and they had to cut the poles down with a buck saw, so that the industry changes quickly. And obviously there's a lot of advancements in my industry, particularly due to fire and things like that, because
Sure.
the wildfires, and, you with your background from, knowing of California, that's been 2018, one of the nation's largest utility filed for bankruptcy in 2018 due to wildfires. And, so that's been a big change. And that also, example, that's another thing they did to kind of stay abreast of this industry is I went through the training and became a certified fire and explosion investigator. Which led me to being retained on the LA fires, which is, an interesting thing in itself. So I think I think the worst thing that we can do is sit back and not stay involved, because I don't care what industry you're in, but particularly, the majority of people are probably medical experts out there, and man, talk about a fast changing industry that you have to stay in tune with.
You had mentioned earlier on, one of the things that you like to ask during a initial phone call is, where are we in this case, right? Because as you were saying, some of these actions go out years, decades, however long. Do you feel that you are typically brought in with sufficient time to get everything sorted before you need to return a report, or do you find yourself a little bit under the gun sometimes?
No, actually, I've been pretty fortunate with that. And part of it is because particularly some cases I've had in California that were scheduled for trial, they keep pushing them out. The courts here in this area are still behind. They're still trying to get caught up on all the COVID lawsuits they had to deal with. So they keep, kicking the can down the road, if it will. So that's helped out a lot. But I was even just recently retained for an incident that they're not even, the lawsuits haven't even started yet, but they just wanted, but they're thinking far enough ahead that they just want to be able to, if they're going to be accused of this, they want to be able to nip it in the butt right from the very beginning. So I would say I've not really had to rush. There's been a couple of times like I'll get sort of a frantic call. Oh, something just changed. We need this, but it hasn't been anything too daunting. And, those are my clients, right? So if I have to pull an all-nighter and stay 24 hours to get something in, I'm going to do that. But it hasn't been that way. It's been pretty, actually, some of them, I've gotten a little bit wiser. And, one thing that I kind of feel bad about is, some information comes in and, I get reams of paper and long files and stuff, and I spend all the time learning about it. And then next, it's months down the road before you have to, I got to go back through and review all the stuff that I did already. So, I have a case right now, a major one. But my report's not due until November. And I got the case probably 3 months ago. So, and I'm just starting into that one now, I to answer your question, I've had adequate time to prepare for everything at this point.
As a newer expert witness with a lot of experience, but newer as an expert witness, what sorts of actions have you been a party to, and which actions do you look forward to?
Well, my impression is it's again, it's a little bit different. I guess I'm not completely green in the legal aspect of things because I had to deal with it so much in my prior roles. It's like, one thing that we have to be careful of is that, learning a few different things. Like, for example, I'm 100% sure that's what happened. Well, what you're now doing is you're saying, oh, without a shadow of doubt, even though you weren't there and you came to this conclusion through a series of hypotheses and testing those hypotheses, you certain terms like, well, more likely than not, to use certain terms like that. So that's been very interesting. Being careful not to paint yourself in a corner, because, if you put out something like that, you say 100%, well, now all of a sudden, an opposing attorney is going to start throwing a bunch of math equations at you. And in fact, there's a really good example of that. They were questioning, cross-examining an expert witness. And he was talking about, how he came up with some calculations. And the attorney says, well, walk me through how you did that. It was very simple stuff, right? I mean, if you have a basic understanding of math, but he couldn't do it, so he's, well, I use my computer to do that. When the attorney's like, well, it's fairly simple math. Can't you just tell us, so you have to be really careful, I think, on what you say, and what you say also, that it can, and if there's a way to use it against you, they'll do it during cross-examination. Another thing that's been, I say, very interesting to me is, I like to write. I've written a lot of, policies over the course of time. I've had, you name it, and I like to do that. But, now in this role, I don't, a lot of times they'll recommend writing papers and things like that. But one thing you have to keep in mind is, whatever you put down, it's there forever. Right. So if you're making some opinion on something and, an attorney digs it up and it's 10 years later, I mean, I'm sure you yourself have had opinions that have changed over the course of, decades of being alive, so you have to be careful with that sort of stuff,
Absolutely. And if you are impeached on something that you once said, maybe it's taken out of context, maybe you have changed your mind. Is that something that you've had to contend with at all yet?
No, I haven't, because I kind of learned that early on because I contended with it years earlier when making a statement, and at a deposition when I was representative of a company, and then having it come back and bite me in the butt and have to, fortunately I wasn't BSing anybody, so I was able to prove my point. But if you weren't prepared for that, you just look like, then you lose credibility, right? If you can't substantiate the statements that you're making, or, support your hypotheses, your opinions, you just look like, you just lost all credibility with the jury. And I haven't had to deal with that. And you asked about one of the things that I'm looking forward to. Now I've not had to go to court yet, and I really, really want to. And, but I know that probably scares a lot of people, but I'm excited for that. And the reason for me it's exciting is because, I started training apprentices, line apprentices. I've trained thousands of them over my career, apprentices and journeyman linemen and stuff. And it's a very complex subject, electricity, right? It's invisible, but it can kill you. And, there's so many, how does all this stuff work? And it's very confusing because you can't physically see anything. So I found ways over the course of time training apprentices and people to help them see very complex subjects in a simplified manner. So I'm really I've got all kinds of demonstrable, things here that I really want to apply. And I just haven't had the opportunity yet. So,
what are some of the techniques that you use when you're teaching or explaining to an attorney some of these complex subjects, to be able to get it across to a layperson in a way that's useful?
Well, one of the things I'm really excited to do is I have what's called a Tesla coil, and essentially it's a coil that's energized, and if you bring a ground close enough to it, it'll make an arc. Right. So there's, I'm in a case where basically someone was they were doing work they shouldn't have been doing anyways. They were injured, but I now had the ability to take the exact piece of equipment that they were using and attach it to the ground and move it close enough to that Tesla coil to show that the arc took place. Now, granted, it's just a little, buzz of an arc that I'm bringing versus the
Sure.
huge explosion that took place with the high voltage stuff. But and another thing too is, there's certain things that in my trade that you can do with rubber gloves on, and there's certain things that you cannot do with rubber gloves on. And in this case, the operation they were using the wrong method. So, for example, I'm able to bring in the actual tool and describe, this is what was supposed to be used, and this is what they did. So just things that, without having my background, there's no way you'd know that, so that's what and I just unfortunately haven't been able to apply that yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. Before we wrap up, do you have any last advice that you care to share with other expert witnesses or attorneys who are working with experts?
I guess the advice that I would share is open communication. When I think we need to find out how people prefer to communicate, because some people like a text message, some people like email, some people just want phone calls. I'm old school. I like to use phone calls because you get more out of it that way. So ask a lot of questions. Ask how you can be. What do they expect of you? Right. I think that's one of the biggest things that advice is. One, be professional. And ask them, hey man, show me the target. What's the bullseye look like? And communicate with the people. And that includes everything, even like billing. I've found that some people like very detailed billing. Some people want almost nothing there. So you need to find out what's expected of you. I think if you want to be successful, that's probably learn everything you can. If you're not learning, that's on you, because there's so much stuff out there, and so much is free, so that'd be I think my biggest thing. Find out what the target is. What do they expect from you? What's the target? What's the bullseye look like? And then, and go from there and just do the best you can and just, maintain your integrity through it all.
Setting expectations, sage advice. Mr. Larson, thank you so much for joining me here today.
That was my pleasure. I really appreciate it. I had fun.
Absolutely. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for joining us for another edition of Engaging Experts. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Engaging Experts. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com.